By the late 1770s, the British Empire faced a daunting challenge. The American colonies, once considered a loyal and integral part of the empire, had become the center of a costly and divisive war. The revolutionary conflict, which began with skirmishes in the northern colonies, had now spiraled into a full-scale, costly rebellion. Britain's initial strategy focused on controlling the major cities in the north, such as New York and Philadelphia. But these efforts failed to crush the rebellion. Frustrated by the lack of progress, British leaders turned their attention to the southern colonies, devising what would become known as the Southern Strategy. This shift was not merely a military decision, but a calculated move shaped by both complex political and economic factors alongside social unrest. The Southern Strategy's principal architect was Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the Colonies in Great Britain. Germain believed that the South was key to restoring British control over the colonies. His confidence stemmed from reports provided by exiled loyalist governors such as James Wright of Georgia and Josiah Martin of North Carolina. These governors painted a picture of the southern colonies as bastions of loyalist sentiment filled with colonists eager to support the crown if just given the chance. According to their accounts, the southern aristocracy, reliant on British trade and wary of revolutionary chaos, would welcome the British forces not as conquerors but as liberators. Germain's strategy relied heavily on the idea that these loyalists would rise up in large numbers and provide local support that could tip the scale in Britain's favor. Economic considerations also played a crucial role in the decision to focus on the South. The southern colonies were vital to the empire's economy, producing lucrative cash crops like tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton, all off the backs of slave labor. These commodities were essential not only for the colonial economy, but also for the entire global trade network owned by the British. By regaining control over these plantations, British leaders hoped to deprive the revolutionaries of critical economic resources while bolstering their own war effort. However, the Southern Strategy's reliance on economic exploitation introduced tensions within the region. One of the most controversial aspects of the British approach was their promise of freedom to enslaved individuals who joined their forces. This policy, initially implemented by Lord Dunmore in Virginia in 1775, was expanded as the war moved south. And while it was successful in attracting thousands of newly freed slaves to the British military, it also alienated many of the wealthy southern planters whose support the British desperately needed if they were going to control the South. You see, these southern planters owned all of the land outside of the cities and also controlled the overwhelming majority of the wealth. Political pressures in Britain further shaped the Southern Strategy. By 1778, the war's unpopularity was growing, and public opinion increasingly turned against the government. The entry of France into the war exacerbated the situation, transforming the conflict into a global struggle that stretched British resources quite thin. In this context, Germain and his advisors argued that a decisive campaign in the South could achieve a much-needed victory both militarily and politically. The revolution had now turned into merely a theater of a global conflict. The Southern Strategy was born out of this mixture of optimism, desperation, and political calculation. Yet, as events would soon reveal, the realities on the ground in the southern colonies would undermine the strategy's fundamental assumptions, exposing the deep flaws in Britain's approach to the war. Another important factor in the development of the Southern Strategy was the British perception of the South's social and political landscape. As I mentioned before, the goal of the Southern campaign was to gain control and the loyalties of the Southern planters. See, Southern society was deeply, hierarchical, with a powerful planter elite dominating the economy and local governments. British officials believed that these elites, many of whom had ties to Britain, would naturally align themselves with the crown once they saw the benefits of British control, which in their mind was a more secure and lucrative trading economy and global network that they would have access to export their cash crops. However, this assumption overlooked the extent to which many planters were committed to the revolutionary cause or were simply just unwilling to risk their fortunes by siding with a foreign power. After all, if Britain were to actually lose this war, any southern planter or slave owner would risk losing their entire fortune and be branded as traitors. Additionally, the region's diverse population, including small farmers, enslaved people, and indigenous groups, complicated efforts to secure widespread support. The South, simply put, was just too rural for a large force to exert control over. The British also underestimated the logistical challenges of conducting a war in the South. If any of you have been to the American South, the region's vast and varied geography is very apparent. In this one area, you have dense forests, swamps, rivers, mosquito-infested wetlands, alligators. You also have mountains, plains, any kind of geography apart from a desert the American South has. And adding on to that, you have much more intense weather. The summers are hot and muggy, and the winters, while moderate, can also be home to massive snowstorms. Moreover, the South's dispersed population, like I mentioned before, meant that control over key cities such as Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, did not necessarily translate to control of the surrounding countryside. It would, in fact, be much more like the North, where the British would control large metropolitan areas, and then the Americans, or patriots, would be able to do literally whatever they wanted in the countryside. From an outside viewpoint, guerrilla warfare, led by patriot forces, seems like it could be used to exploit these challenges to devastating effect. This is totally not foreshadowing. The influence of Loyalist exiles on British policy cannot be overstated. Figures like Wright and Martin, driven by a desire to regain their lost power and status and wealth, often provided overly optimistic assessments of Southern loyalty because it was within their best interest. Their assurances will play into British hopes of a quick and decisive victory. However, as you may know, I am talking about the year 1778, and the war will not be concluded until, spoiler alert, 1783, 5 years later. When, spoiler alert, Loyalist support fails to materialize on the scale anticipated, British forces will find themselves isolated and quite vulnerable. This miscalculation highlights the dangers of relying too heavily on unverified intelligence and formulating military strategy, and the dangers of non-military personnel gaining power over military planning. Still, the plan is approved, and things are set into motion. As Charles Cornwallis's men begin to deploy south, we now begin what will be the final stage of the American Revolution. The big question remains to be answered. Will the British be able to quell the rebellion? Will the Americans gain their independence? Will the Southern strategy pay off? Or will it end up costing the British absolutely everything? This is all yet to be seen. But what I can say for sure is that the resulting military campaign will change the course of world history forever.